There's a concept called deep canvassing, and this is an approach about being open, listening, and asking questions, not really trying to persuade someone to support your candidate or cause. The goal is really to create a connection with someone and working to understand where they are coming from.
You may have heard there's an election coming up. But even if you aren't listening to this episode when it comes out and it's past November 5th, 2024, don't skip this episode. The information we are going to cover today is applicable not just to the 2024 election, but all elections. We are not going to talk about specific races or candidates, but instead we're going to cover tools and strategies for you to be an informed voter, especially when it comes to climate issues. I'm Barry Weigel. This is Plugging In. Welcome to Plugging In, powering our way to a brighter and healthier New York. I'm your host, Barry Weigel. Each episode on this podcast, we will discuss a different topic related to clean energy, explaining complex topics in a way you can understand. Become part of the community as we help to make a brighter and healthier New York.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we Tomorrow we breathe easier. Tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in. The future of New York is here.
Before we get into today's episode, I have a very quick favor to ask. If you're enjoying this podcast, please give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening on and leave a review. It is the #1 way we can grow. Thank you. Joining us on this episode of Plugging In is Louisa Hackett. Louisa is the founder of the group Community Votes, a group that works with nonprofits and community groups to encourage voter turnout in a nonpartisan way. Louisa, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we'll start with some logistics questions, and then we'll get into more philosophical questions. But how do you find out, #1, if you're registered to vote and where you need to go on Election Day?
So there's a website called ballotready.org, and you can go there and check your voter registration. You can register to vote if you're not registered. You can find your polling place and also find out what is on your ballot and who represents you now. And it's a nonpartisan organization, and they have information for all the states.
Excellent. And here in New York, we have early voting, which is cool. So by the time this podcast comes out, we will be either starting or into early voting, I think.
Yes, that's correct.
Excellent. So you can listen to this podcast, do your research, and then go vote later that day. Perfect. So this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek question, but it's kind of important to remember what's at stake. So here in New York, again, we know that the state presidential electoral votes are probably going to go to a certain candidate. So do people need to worry about voting this year?
There's so many different reasons to vote, and I'll just point out a few. First, as you said, New Yorkers aren't just voting for president. They'll also be electing who will represent them in Washington, in the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And some say, including the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, that the results of the 2022 midterm election in New York meant Democrats lost control of the House. And this obviously then made it almost impossible for Biden in his last 2 years in office to get legislation passed that reflected his platform and priorities. So voting for Congress impacts the balance of power. So that is one reason. A second reason is New Yorkers will also be voting for who's going to represent them in Albany. And these legislators make many decisions impacting people's lives, whether taxes should be lowered or increased, whether wealthier people should pay more in taxes, as well as all kinds of policies from climate change, affordable housing to criminal justice. Another reason is having a high turnout in a non-swing state, such as New York, can contribute to what happened in 2016, in which Donald Trump won the Electoral College vote, but lost the national popular vote by almost 3 million. This also happened in 2000 when George W. Bush lost the popular vote to Al Gore, but won the electoral vote. That kind of result can make it easier to argue that the Electoral College doesn't make sense. And lastly, New Yorkers will have a chance to cast a vote for equal rights. There's a ballot question, Prop 1, that if passed would add to the Constitution the right to an abortion and to make sure no New Yorker can be discriminated against by the government based on gender, age, ethnicity, pregnancy status, disability, or being LGBT. So those are just a few reasons to vote in November.
Yes, and very important reasons. And just by driving around, I can tell that there's also some town elections that are going to be held, which can be very important for clean energy projects, which is what this podcast talks about. So you go on Ballot Ready, you find out where you need to vote and how to vote. How can you look up your sample ballot to know exactly what you'll be voting on?
Ballot Ready, you can see the candidates on your ballot. If you want to actually see what your ballot's going to look like, which can be very helpful to people, every county in New York has a board of elections, and these offices have websites that have ballot information. So you can actually see what the ballot's going to look like, how it's laid out. You can also go there to find out where your poll site will be.
This is a clean energy podcast. So if that's what you're kind of thinking about as one of the issues you want to research or learn more about how a candidate feels about that, how can you look up a specific candidate and see how they feel about a certain issue?
You can check a candidate's website to see if they have stated any positions on the issue. If the candidate has been in an elected office before, you can check their voting record on any energy-related policy issues. And another way is to see if they have any endorsements from groups that are pro or anti-clean energy.
And I know some groups will put out that slate of endorsed candidates, so you can kind of go to that group's website if you've heard of them or you agree with their positions on things.
That's right.
So this kind of plays into what you were talking about the Electoral College versus popular vote, but I want to take it down to maybe a town level or a state legislator level. If they win by 52% or 65% or more, do you think that impacts the way they might vote or govern on certain issues if they have a stronger mandate or more of a majority?
Yes. The people who are elected really pay attention to who votes for them. And if a large percentage of their district supports an issue, it gives them, as you said, more of a mandate to talk about it and to create and vote for policy and laws to address it. They also pay attention to who reaches out to them. So if someone emails them and includes their address, they're going to check the voter file to make sure they are a voter. And those voters are going to get more attention than someone who doesn't vote. So it's important to vote often and in every election.
And that echoes a point that we've heard earlier on this podcast about reaching out to your elected officials about issues you care about. So apart from an election, have you seen or heard stories? Does this actually make a difference? Do politicians or their staff read this and take letters into account when people write in?
Yes, they do. There's staff assigned to that. That's their job. So they are very responsive and do respond.
We're lucky in America that voting is a secret process. You go into the voting booth, there's no one in there with you. But a lot of people feel passionate about the way that they feel about certain issues. And it can be hard to talk about issues, especially nowadays, whether it's clean energy, environment issues, or any other range of the issues that are on the table this year. Do you have any tips for people that might want to express an opinion to a friend or family member about an issue and how they could go about that in a way that doesn't, harm a relationship?
There's a concept called deep canvassing, and this is an approach about being open, listening, and asking questions, not really trying to persuade someone to support your candidate or cause. The goal is really to create a connection with someone and working to understand where they are coming from, listening, and then sharing a story about yourself, something that you experienced that can't be argued with, not your opinion about an issue. So, for example, on climate change, you could start by asking how important climate change will be on deciding their vote. If they say not that important, you could ask them to explain why they feel that way. You can also ask them what issues they care about. And then you can share a personal story about why climate change or clean energy is so important to you and why you care so much about it. Again, it's your experiences and not your opinion. And I'm not a psychologist, but I do think it's rare when a person's going to change their mind right in front of you. They're more likely to think about what you said and especially think about if they felt respected and listened to. And maybe they'll take that into consideration when they go vote.
That's a very interesting and good point. So you're not looking to get into an argument with someone or convince them in the moment, because that probably never works or rarely works. So it's more about planting the seed in a respectful way, and you never know what could happen.
Right. And sharing why it's so important to you, why you're so passionate about it.
So this feels like a special year, a little bit different than usual. So we've seen a lot of misinformation about probably every issue out there, but as being a clean energy podcast, we've seen a lot of clean energy misinformation being brought up in certain races in New York. Is misinformation always been around during elections, or is this different than usual?
Well, I think this is a really good question. I think there's always been ways to distort an opponent's views. That's probably always happened, probably since the first election. However, I think the level of bad information out there now is new. And the so many wide variety of venues on social media to get messages out. Then there's a couple types of information. There's misinformation, which is information people pass along because they think it's true. They don't realize they're spreading it. But there's also disinformation, and that's bad actors spreading info they know is not true. And in addition, there's an enormous rise of something called deep fakes, where people are manipulating media and voice and pictures. And I'm telling you, it's getting harder and harder to know and be able to see what's a deep fake and not a deep fake. On the positive side, the government, U.S. government, is proactively trying to stop the spread. In the beginning of September, the Justice Department seized 32 internet domains being used by the Russian government to influence the election. And if you want to educate yourself about how to identify deep fakes, there's organizations doing this work. There's one called truemedia.org and another one called rumorguard.org. So there's an ability to sort of, if you see something, to maybe check it against these organizations.
What advice do you have for people that might just feel fed up by the whole process, or they can't, no matter how hard they try, they can't find true information, they don't know who to trust, and they just kind of feel not even apathetic, but just kind of dejected going into the process this November?
I guess I would say go to organizations and websites that are journalists and support journalists. Social media is not, it's a platform to spread marketing information and to spread information. It's not, news is on there, but their purpose isn't to educate and inform the public. So I believe it's important to get multiple sources of information from respected news organizations. And when you get bombarded with information, to sort of slow down, look at it to see if it makes sense, verify where it came from, as a way to sort of prevent yourself from maybe passing along misinformation or disinformation.
Well, that was my last question. So, Louisa, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. It's obviously a busy time of the year and every 4 years for you, I'm sure, or 2 years. I'm sure you're out there all the time encouraging people to vote. So I appreciate you taking time away from the busy election season to speak with us today.
You are most welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Plugging In. I hope you learned something, and I hope you share this knowledge with someone else. It would be incredibly helpful if you leave us a 5-star review wherever you found this podcast. If there's a topic you would like us to cover in the future, or have a question about clean energy, send us an email at podcast@aceny.org. You can follow us on social media using the links in the show notes, or consider joining our Clean Energy Supporters mailing list at aceny.org/support. Your support is crucial to creating a brighter and healthier New York. I'll see you next time.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in.